Zara Kess had perfected the art of being invisible. On a trading station housing dozens of species, that took considerable skill. But she'd learned early that being seen meant being judged, and being judged meant being found wanting. The Mirean people were known across the sector for their beauty, bioluminescent markings that shifted with emotions, creating living art on their skin. Perfect symmetry was prized above all else, patterns that displayed controlled, appropriate feelings in balanced, aesthetically pleasing ways. Zara's markings were irregular, asymmetric, chaotic, everything Mirean culture considered ugly. From childhood, she'd been told her markings were wrong. Medical treatments to regularize them failed. Behavioral therapy to teach control accomplished nothing. Her family eventually suggested suppressors that would dim her bioluminescence entirely, hide the evidence of her defectiveness. She'd refused. But she'd learned to hide in other ways, concealing clothing, jobs behind screens, avoiding social situations where people could see her face. Now she worked as data analyst on Crossroads Haven, a position that let her stay isolated. She wore heavy hoods that covered most of her bioluminescent markings, kept her head down, avoided mirrors. She believed with absolute certainty carved from decades of judgment that she was ugly. The trading station's diversity should have made her feel less isolated. With dozens of species, surely Mirean beauty standards didn't matter. But somehow the weight of her culture's judgment followed her everywhere. When she encountered other Mireans, their perfectly controlled patterns marking them as everything she wasn't, the familiar shame crushed down harder. Her routine was interrupted when a human trade delegation arrived. Zara barely noticed initially, just another species passing through. Then she miscalculated timing on an inventory check, running into someone in a quiet corridor. They literally collided, Zara not watching where she was going, the human unable to see around equipment crates he was carrying. The crates fell. Zara's concealing hood fell back. And for the first time in months, someone saw her face, saw her irregular, asymmetric, uncontrolled bioluminescent markings that had been her source of shame for her entire life. She froze, waiting for the inevitable. Polite turning away, uncomfortable silence, carefully neutral expression trying not to show disgust. Instead, the human stared at her for a moment and then said with complete sincerity, "You're beautiful." Zara's mind blanked. The word didn't compute. Beautiful applied to her, by someone actually looking directly at her exposed markings. She'd heard many words used to describe her appearance: irregular, unfortunate, pitiable, wrong, never beautiful. What? She managed, voice barely functioning. "Your markings," the human said, gesturing to her face where bioluminescence flickered with shock and confusion in patterns she couldn't control. "They're incredible, like living art. I've never seen anything like it." He wasn't mocking her. His tone was genuine, his expression awed rather than disgusted. "I'm David Chen, by the way, engineer with the trade delegation." He smiled. "Sorry about the collision. Couldn't see around the crates." Zara's first instinct was assuming he was lying, being cruel in some way she didn't understand. But humans weren't known for elaborate social cruelty, and nothing in his body language suggested malice. He actually seemed impressed. "They're irregular," Zara heard herself say, parroting what she'd been told her entire life. "Asymmetric, uncontrolled. They're considered defective by my people." David frowned. "Defective, they're mesmerizing. The way the colors shift and flow, it's like watching a sunset or auroras. How is that defective?" "Because they're not symmetrical. Because I can't control them. Because they reveal every emotion without discipline. In Mirean culture, that's shameful." Zara was pulling her hood back up, trying to hide again, but her hands shook, and the bioluminescence betrayed her confusion and desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, this human actually meant what he was saying. David reached out carefully, not touching but stopping her movement. "I don't know much about Mirean culture, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but from a human perspective, you're beautiful." The fact that your markings show your emotions, that's not weakness, that's honesty. The asymmetry isn't a flaw, it's uniqueness. You look like no one else in the entire galaxy, and that's incredible. Zara had spent her entire life being told she should be ashamed of looking like no one else. Hearing it framed as incredible rather than shameful cracked something open in her chest that she'd kept sealed for years. "You're just saying that," she whispered, "but it wasn't really an accusation, it was a plea. Please let this be real." "I'm really not," David responded. "Look, I'm an engineer. I spend my life looking at structures and patterns and designs. Your markings, they're complex, asymmetric, chaotic in the mathematical sense, which means they're following rules that are just more sophisticated than simple symmetry. It's beautiful in a way that perfect symmetry never could be because it's unique and alive and real." He paused, then added more gently, "And even if I wasn't an engineer, even if I just looked at you as a person meeting another person, I'd still think you're beautiful. Because beauty isn't about following someone's rules for what's acceptable. It's about being genuine. And everything about your markings says you're incapable of being anything but genuine." Zara realized she was crying, tears mixing with bioluminescence that had shifted to colors she hadn't displayed in years, emotions she hadn't let herself feel. Hope. Fragile, terrifying hope that maybe she wasn't irredeemably ugly. That maybe one person in the entire galaxy saw something in her worth looking at. That night, Zara did something she hadn't done in years. She looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked, without immediately turning away or adjusting lighting to minimize her markings' visibility. She tried to see what David saw, the complex patterns, the honest emotional display, the uniqueness. It was hard. Decades of internalized shame didn't evaporate from one kind word. But there was a crack in the certainty that she was ugly, and through that crack, possibility seeped in. She started seeing David around the station, not intentionally seeking him out, but becoming aware of his presence. He waved when he spotted her, always friendly, never treating their encounter as something to forget or be embarrassed about. One day he sat near her in the common dining area, and despite every instinct telling her to stay hidden and safe, Zara found herself talking to him. They developed something like friendship. David told her about Earth, about human diversity, about how different cultures have wildly different beauty standards, and how humans learned that beauty is cultural construct rather than objective truth. Zara talked about Mirean culture, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty about how rigid beauty standards shaped her entire life. How she'd avoided relationships because who would want someone who looked like her? How she'd chosen careers that minimized social interaction. How she'd become expert at making herself invisible. David listened without trying to fix everything or dismiss her pain. He acknowledged her experiences were real. That judgment she'd faced was cruel. That internalizing that cruelty over decades wasn't something that disappeared overnight. But he also gently, persistently challenged her assumptions. When she called herself ugly, he asked, "By whose standards? Who decided irregular markings are ugly?" When she talked about being defective, he countered, "Defective compared to what? An arbitrary ideal most Mirans probably don't meet either." He showed her human art, pointing out how Earth cultures celebrate asymmetry, chaos, imperfection. How Japanese aesthetics prize wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection. How some of humanity's most celebrated art deliberately breaks symmetry because perfect symmetry is boring, predictable, lifeless. "Look," David said one day, showing her images of Earth's aurora borealis. "Humans consider these among the most beautiful natural phenomena in our world. They're chaotic, unpredictable, never the same twice. Your markings remind me of these, living auroras on your skin. How is that anything but beautiful?" Zara wanted to believe him, but there was a voice in her head, internalized from family, from Mirean society, from decades of judgment, that insisted he was wrong. The crisis came when Zara encountered other Mirans on the station, a delegation visiting for trade negotiations. She saw them in common areas, their perfectly symmetrical markings displaying controlled, appropriate emotions. Everything she wasn't, and she felt the familiar shame crushing back down. One Mirean delegate approached her. "You're Mirean. I'm surprised to see one of our people in a position that requires public visibility." Carefully neutral words with clear implication. Someone with Zara's irregular markings shouldn't be where people could see her. David intercepted the conversation smoothly, drawing attention away. After the delegate left, he saw the defeat in Zara's dull, suppressed colors. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't let them take this from you. You are starting to see yourself differently. They're my people. They know Mirean aesthetics. You're kind, David, but you don't understand our culture." "You're right, I don't," David agreed. "But I understand beauty, and I understand that letting other people, even your own culture, define your worth is a choice. A hard choice to resist, but still a choice." The turning point came during the station's cultural festival. David convinced Zara to attend, not to perform, just to observe. She agreed reluctantly, wearing usual concealing clothing, planning to stay in background. But the festival was overwhelming in the best way, dozens of species displaying their cultures, and the sheer diversity of aesthetics and beauty standards was stunning. Species with scales, fur, feathers, bioluminescence, none of it. Cultures that prized symmetry, others celebrating asymmetry. Some valuing emotional restraint, others encouraging passionate display. Zara watched a human performance art piece, dancer whose movements were deliberately imperfect, stumbling and recovering, creating beauty from authentic struggle rather than polished perfection. She watched a Caltharian musician whose crystalline body created sound through imperfections and cracks, making music that wouldn't exist if they were perfect. She watched species after species celebrating beauty in forms Mirean culture would consider flawed. And she realized, beauty isn't universal. What Mirean culture taught her was ugly. Dozens of other cultures would find striking, interesting, beautiful. The standards she'd internalized weren't objective truth, they were one culture's preference. David found her during the festival, and this time when he told her she was beautiful, Zara didn't immediately reject it. She was still learning to believe it, still fighting decades of internalized shame, but there was genuine possibility now. "I want to show you something," David said, leading her to the human delegation's display. They'd created an interactive art installation, bioluminescent paint responding to movement and emotion, creating flowing, chaotic, asymmetric patterns. And at the center was a large mirror. "Stand there," David instructed gently. Zara did, and for the first time in years, she looked at herself without immediately turning away. Her bioluminescent markings shifted with her emotions, nervousness, hope, fear, curiosity, creating patterns with no symmetry, no control, just honest display of what she was feeling. The art installation responded, projecting her patterns larger, amplifying them into cascading lights across the walls, making her visible to everyone. Zara's first instinct was to hide, to run. But David's hand on her shoulder kept her grounded, and she forced herself to keep looking, to see what he saw, not ugly, irregular markings but complex, living art. Honest emotional display instead of shameful lack of control. Uniqueness instead of defect. People from various species stopped to watch, making appreciative sounds, asking questions about the beautiful bioluminescent patterns. They weren't mocking, they were impressed. And slowly, painfully, Zara started to believe that maybe she wasn't ugly. Maybe she was just different from Mirean ideals, and that difference wasn't inherently inferior. Tears fell, and her bioluminescence shifted to colors she hadn't displayed since childhood: unguarded joy, tentative self-acceptance, gratitude for being seen as something other than defective. "Thank you," she whispered to David, "for seeing me differently, for making me see myself differently." "I didn't make you see anything," David responded gently. "I just told you the truth as I saw it. You did the hard work of letting yourself believe it, of challenging what you'd been taught. That courage, That's beautiful too. Months later, Zara still struggled. Decades of shame don't disappear overnight. Some days she still heard internalized voices telling her to hide, that she was ugly, that she should be ashamed. But she was learning to counter those voices with truth David helped her see. Beauty is subjective. Her markings are unique rather than defective. Honest emotional display is strength rather than weakness. She'd started working in more public-facing roles. She'd let herself make friends. She'd even reconnected with Mireans who quietly admitted they'd always struggled with their culture's rigid standards too. And seeing Zara display her markings openly gave them courage to be less controlled. David and Zara remained close friends, not romantic, but deeply important to each other. He was the first person to see her as beautiful when she couldn't see it herself, and that gift changed her life. When younger aliens who felt unattractive sought Zara's advice, she told them about the human who called her beautiful and meant it. About learning beauty is cultural construct rather than objective truth. About courage required to challenge internalized shame and see yourself through kinder eyes. I spent decades believing I was ugly, she says, because my culture told me the ways I'm different are shameful. But different doesn't mean defective. It means unique. And unique can be beautiful. You just have to find people who see with eyes not limited by one culture's narrow standards. She pauses, remembering that first moment when David's sincere, "You're beautiful," stopped her completely. Sometimes all it takes is one person seeing you truly, honestly, without filters of prejudice or cultural conditioning. One person who looks at you and sees beauty where you've only seen flaws. That can be enough to start healing years of pain. And in her quarters, where she finally has mirrors, Zara sometimes stops and looks at herself, at the irregular, asymmetric, uncontrolled bioluminescent markings that shift with her emotions. And slowly, gradually, she's learning to see what David saw from the beginning. Not ugly, not defective, not shameful, just herself. Honest, unique, and beautiful in ways that matter more than any cultural standard. It's not easy. Some days are harder than others. But kindness reshaped the way she sees her own reflection, and that's a gift